72. Each week, the two best spellers who stood from the rest were allowed to choose their teams for the next week. Caddie and Tom both had the sportsman's love of any test of skill, but Caddie was the best speller. She pored over the tattered spelling book with excited concentration, and she was usually the first to toss back curls and fling up her hand to let the teacher know that she was ready to spell. She and Jane Flusher, Jane's brother Sam, were usually the last ones standing at the end of the match. And then it was a fierce struggle to see which one of them would go down first. The teacher had to turn to the back of the speller to pick a lily or siliquise or titillate before Caddie and the Flushers would be spelled out, and have to take a seat in laughing confusion and defeat. As much rivalry entered into choosing the teams as an actual spell down. The best spellers were promptly snapped up, and the worst ones left simmering in their shame until the end of the choosing. Saturday afternoons were free. Sometimes the young Woodlawns went coasting or sleigh riding. Sometimes they all went with Tom to set traps for muskrats on the ice. Sometimes, and that was best of all, Father took Tom and Caddie and Warren with him to the mill of Eau-Claire, and let them skate on the mill pond. The ice froze there in a smooth sheet over the pointed pond, and only a little clearing of snow was needed to make good skating. It was one Saturday late in December that Caddie came near drowning for the second time that year. Father had brought them to Eau-Claire for the first skating of the season, and while he was busy in the mill, Caddie and the two boys strapped to their skates and tried the ice. Tom was an expert skater, cutting figure-eights and scrolls and spirals in fine profusion over the new ice. Caddie and Warren were ambitious to do as well as Tom, but they could not only follow along in awkward imitation of his skill. What they lacked in skill they tried to make up in daring. "You better be careful of that black ice," called Tom. "It's kind of thin-looking." "Who's afraid?" laughed Caddie, and Warren said, "I dare you to see how far out you can go, Caddie." "All right," said Caddie, "you can't scare me." And away she went. The black ice began to creak and then to crack. Crash, smash, Caddie was in over her head again. But what is only an adventure in the summer lake may be no joke in an ice-covered pond, when Warren shrieked his alarm. But there was no time to fetch Father from the mill. Tom saw that only instant action on his part could save Caddie. With cool presence of mind, he made Warren lie down on the ice, and catching hold of Warren's feet, he pushed him over the thin ice until he could reach Caddie's groping hands. "Hold tight, Warren," he shouted. "I'll pull you both in." And he did. Nobody made much fuss over it. Pioneer children were always having mishaps, but they were expected to know how to use their heads in emergencies. But it changed a large part of the winter for Caddie. Father dried her off as best he could in the engine room of the mill, wrapped her in buffalo robes, and drove her home. Mother put her into a steaming washtub before the kitchen fire, and then to bed with hot stones wrapped in flannel, and hot tea made of dried leaves of wild strawberry plants. But Caddie caught a bad cold, which kept her in bed for a week and home from school for several weeks after that. Her mother sat on the foot of Caddie's bed the night of the accident, with a cup in one hand and a spoon in the other, and shook her head in despair. Exasperation and fond concern struggled on her pretty face. "Caddie, why can't you behave like a young lady?" she sighed. "You'll be the death of me, if not of yourself. Only a few weeks ago you were fighting with the awful Obadiah Jones. Yes, Hetty told me about it. And you've nearly killed yourself skating on thin ice. It isn't one thing. If it isn't one thing, it's another." "I'm sorry, Mother," croaked Caddie hoarsely from the depths of a red flannel bandage. Well," sighed Mrs. Woodlawn, "it seems to be your nature. What will you have for supper? A little turkey broth?" Caddie sighed. "Isn't there any bean soup, Mother?" "No, it's turkey, dear." "Well, turkey, then." That's a good girl. Go to sleep now." Christmas came and went while Caddie was still recovering. She had intended to spend some of her silver dollar for presents, but it still lay snug and safe in the wooden trinket box because she was not able to take it to the store. They hung their stockings by the fireplace on Christmas Eve, and Santa Claus came down the chimney here in Wisconsin just as he did in Boston and St. Louis. But the apples and nuts which he packed around their toys were strangely like those which they themselves had picked. "Mother," said Warren, "what are we going to have to eat for Christmas dinner?" "Mince pie, Warren," said Mrs. Woodlawn brightly. "That's good, but I mean, what else?" "Why, turkey and cranberries, of course. Folks always have that for Christmas." Warren sighed. "I know, but I thought maybe we'd have salt pork or something, just for a change. Now, Warren, you run along and play. There are plenty of folks who'd be glad of a good turkey dinner on Christmas. You should count your blessings." After Christmas, Tom and Warren and Hetty went back to school, and the house seemed very empty. Caddie was not alone to play with Minnie and Baby Joe because of her cold, and when other household tasks were done, Mother and Clara were busy sewing carpet rags. Father was at the mill, and Mrs. Conroy did not want to be bothered in her kitchen. Caddie looked at the family Bible and read Tom's dog-eared book of Andersen's fairy tales. She went into the parlor and looked at the Caroline table, which really belonged to her, although Mother would scarcely let her touch it, for fear she might mar it. It had been made by one of Mother's ancestors for his wife Caroline, and ever since that time it had come down to all the Carolines of the family. Over it hung the silhouette of Great-Aunt Kitty, who had been the last Caroline before Caddie. But even a nice little mahogany table, which really belongs to you, isn't much company, and grows tiresome after you have looked at it for a while. Caddie's wandering feet took her upstairs to the attic. Here were old boxes from Boston and a beautiful round-topped trunk lined with colored paper, with pictures of smiling children decorating the various compartments, and on a low shelf with a row of clocks, waiting for Father's expert hand to mend them. The attic was drafty, but near the end of the stairs a big brick chimney came up from the kitchen, and there it was warm. Caddie drew some of the boxes over the chimney and sat with her back against it while she looked through them. Most of the things she had seen often enough. There were too many people in the family to allow old things to accumulate unused. Only two things which she had found puzzled and surprised Caddie. She found them in the bottom of one of the boxes, and she knew that she had never seen them before. They were a pair of little red breeches and a pair of small wooden-soled clogs. Surely they had belonged either to Warren or to Tom. For some time they puzzled and excited her. Then she put them neatly away in the box, resolved to ask Mother about them as soon as she went downstairs. Now she turned her attention to the clocks. They had been at the back of her mind all the time. She had been reserving them as a sort of final treat, as she often did with the things she liked best. She picked them up one by one and shook them to see if they would start ticking. Among the others stood the circuit rider's clock. Caddie remembered that he had said it was the face of a dead friend. Surely it would be soon time for the circuit rider to return, and Father had not yet started to work upon the clock. How dreadful it would be if the circuit rider should return and find his clock unmended. Caddie turned to the clock thoughtfully in her hands. She had seen Father mend so many of them. Of course they were not all alike inside, but she knew how the little screws came out and how the back came off, and then inside you saw all the fastening wheels and gimcracks. Why shouldn't she mend it herself? She was sure that she could. She sat down with her back against the chimney and began to loosen the screws. It was more of a task than she had supposed. Father's tools were all there on the shelf, and she found a screwdriver of just the right size she needed. The back came off, revealing the two wheels and springs. Caddie knew enough about clocks to see what was the matter. The circuit rider had wound his clock too tightly, and some way the spring had caught so that it could not unwind as it should have done. Caddie looked it over carefully. Then she began to loosen the screws which held it in place. She had to loosen several before she found the right ones. Time slipped away unheeded. She was so deeply absorbed in the clock, her cheeks were flushed and her face bent low over her work, was curtained by dangling curls, and then at last she loosened the right screw. Whiz, bang! The spring fell out with a whiz and hit the low ceiling. Screws and cogwheels flew in every direction. It was like an explosion. The circuit rider's clock had suddenly flown to pieces. Caddie uttered a cry of despair and looked wildly about her. What would her father say? That's page 80, so 73 through 80.